Hi, I'm Peter Singer, and I'm very happy to be talking to you on a conference about climate change that does not involve us all flying around the world and using a lot of fossil fuels and emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, thereby contributing to the very problem that we're talking about. There really are too many conferences that do that. My background is in ethics, and I think that climate change is centrally an ethical issue. So I think it's really critical that people with backgrounds in ethics contribute to this discussion. It's a particularly difficult area to deal with in terms of our conventional ethical attitudes, because those attitudes have evolved and developed in very different eras in which not only were we unaware of the possibility of climate change as a whole, but we also did not really form innate moral responses to problems that are anything like the climate change problem. Let me tell you a little bit what I mean when I'm saying that. Our innate ethical responses, if you want to call them that, developed in small face-to-face societies. For most of our evolutionary history, we lived in groups of somewhere around 150 people perhaps, where we knew all the people in our society, we were relating to them in a face-to-face way, and so we developed inhibitions, for instance, against inflicting violence on them, perhaps other moral rules relating to sexual behavior or to honesty that were necessary for living together. But we didn't develop moral responses for people who are very distant from us, because we didn't really know about people who are very distant from us. We might have had ethical attitudes to neighbouring groups, which may have been friendly or may have been hostile, but in terms of people who we could not physically have any connection with, they were irrelevant. And even today we see the consequences of that narrowness of our moral perspective, because clearly if you look at the newspaper headlines and the way they treat a disaster that happens on the other side of the world, then it gets much less space in the media than a disaster that happens in our own country. So one thing about climate change is, of course, that it does affect everyone in the world. And in fact, the people who are going to be most adversely affected are the people who are often very far from the people who are actually contributing most to the problem. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. But there's also, as well as the geographical distance, there's the question of timescale. We don't see the results of what we're doing in regard to the climate happening right now, in a way that, for example, if we inflict physical violence on somebody, we see the reactions of that right now. And so we develop codes of behaviour and inhibitions about that. But in terms of thinking about the future, and particularly not the next week or month, but the quite distant future, we're not very good at doing that either. We're not very good even in terms of our own well-being or that of our children and grandchildren. We're not really very good at thinking about distant future. We tend to discount the future quite heavily. We put off things that we perhaps should do now because of their good consequences, although they're a bit uncomfortable. Going to the dentist might be an example. We tend to put that off because the fact that it'll have bad consequences for us, but they're some way down the track and perhaps somewhat uncertain, leaves the immediate sense of what's going to happen to be right now. If I have an appointment with the dentist this afternoon, leaves that to be more salient to me. So we're not very good at dealing with distant problems. We're not very good at dealing with problems that are temporally distant. And we're not very good at dealing with problems that don't relate to identifiable individuals. So that's one reason why this is a difficult ethical issue, one set of reasons why this is a difficult ethical issue for us to deal with. It's also difficult for another reason. It's a particular type of ethical problem, sometimes known as the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons, of course, is the idea that if we are grazing cattle on common land, then we can do better by putting more of our own, where I say we, I mean, let's say I as an individual, can do better by putting more of my own cattle onto the commons. But if everybody does that, then the commons will be overgrazed, the grass will die, and nobody will do well. But in that situation, even if in fact we can see the commons deteriorating, my personal interests might be to put more cattle on there because I will still get a larger return, even if it accelerates the degradation of the commons and the greater damage. So climate change is a tragedy of the commons kind of issue, but on the largest scale, on a planetary scale. So that means that it accentuates the problems of the tragedy of the commons. Because whereas if it is a commons with, let's say, a couple of hundred villages putting the cattle on it, we can see perhaps the damage that is being done right now. But in terms of climate change, the damage can't really be seen right now, and we feel, well, there's 7 billion people out there putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, so the difference that my behaviour makes is really minuscule. So that's another aspect that makes it a very difficult problem for us to deal with ethically. And one, therefore, I think in which we really need to do a great deal of hard work in order to try to get people to understand that this is an ethical problem. Yet despite all those difficulties in dealing with this, it's really important that people do see this as an ethical problem. Because if they don't, then they're only going to see it in terms of their own interest, or perhaps in terms of the self-interest of their nation. And it may well be that in terms of their own ethical interest, the interest of their country or of their generation, they don't see quite how potentially damaging, how pressing this is. So a wealthy nation might say, well, we can adjust to many of these problems. If sea levels rise, for example, we can build sea walls, places where it's low. Yes, that will be serious. We can't do it everywhere. If the rainfall patterns change, we can develop irrigation, something of that sort, from one place to another. We can build desalination plants even. There are various remedies that affluent countries may have. But the poorest countries in the world are actually the ones who are going to be most seriously affected by this. These are the countries in which the population actually depends on rainfall for their own subsistence. They're small peasant farmers who are growing their own food. And if the rains fail, they have nowhere else to go. So it's important that we see this as an ethical problem to help people to understand that what we in the affluent countries are doing is, by any reasonable, plausible ethical principle, something that is seriously wrong. And I believe that only if people appreciate that, then can we expect countries where essentially there's democratic decisions about climate change policies, where political leaders put forward their policies before elections, only then can we hope that people will be prepared to say, yes, this may not be the most advantageous thing for me right now, but it is something that we ought to do, not only for our own long-term future, not only for our children and grandchildren, but for people everywhere in the world who otherwise we are seriously harming. How then can we try to help people to see climate change as an ethical problem? I think the analogy here is with dividing up any kind of scarce resource. So if we, for example, have a cake or a pie, and we have a lot of people at a party who would each like a slice of it, then we have a problem of saying, how are we going to divide this? Let's say there are 20 people there and each of them would like a slice that amounts to 1/10 of the pie or cake. Well, obviously they can't all have 1/10 of it. You have to have some principles for dividing it up. And I think we can see climate change as just that kind of very familiar problem of a just distribution of a limited resource that no one owns. The common resource here is the ability of the atmosphere to absorb our waste gases without producing results that none of us want, what's sometimes called dangerous anthropogenic climate change. So severely abnormal weather, increases in floods and heat waves, rises in sea levels, all of those changes in rainfall patterns, all of those kinds of things that we don't really want. That's why we have a scarce resource, the ability of the atmosphere to absorb our waste gases without those effects. It's obviously a resource that no one owns. It is a commons. And we have to divide it up because we no longer live in a world in which each of us can put as much as we would like, as much as would be convenient for us, to burn as much fossil fuel as we like, to eat as much meat as we like, despite the emissions from livestock production. We can't do that. We can't all do that without causing disastrous climate change. So we need some principles of justice to say, how should we then divide up this scarce resource? When philosophers talk about principles of justice, they often divide them into two different categories, what are called historical principles of justice and time slice principles of justice. Historical principles of justice say, to know whether a given distribution is just, you have to look at how it arose. You have to look, for example, as to whether people have acquired property, if that's what we're talking about, by legitimate means, or by stealing or pushing people off the land in order to get their property. That's a historical principle. A time slice principle is one where you just say, look at the distribution as it exists right at this moment. Is that fair or unfair? So I'm going to talk about both of those kinds of principles and see how they apply to climate change. The historical principle would be, who is responsible for the problem? It's the principle, essentially, of the polluter pays, which is often used if, for example, a corporation, a factory puts pollution into a river, they have to pay to clean up the river and compensate people downriver for the damage that they've caused. Or if you walk into a china shop, they may have a sign saying, you broke it, you fix it. Sorry, you broke it, you pay for it. So apply that to climate change, and it's clear that it's the affluent nations that have broken it, that have caused the pollution overwhelmingly, because they are the ones that industrialized many years ago, that put most of the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And because carbon dioxide breaks down very slowly in the atmosphere, they are responsible for most of the carbon dioxide that is still in the atmosphere. So, on the historical principle, we should say those who cause the problem are the ones that need to act. And that would mean it's the affluent nations who've caused the problem, who are the ones who ought to be doing something about it. Disproportionately anyway. They're not the only ones, of course. Now somebody might say, but wait a minute. The affluent nations didn't know until relatively recently that this even was a problem. So are we holding them responsible for doing something that they could not possibly have known was causing a problem? Well, you might have a principle of strict liability where you might say yes to that. You might not. You might say, no, it's only when the scientists of the world realized what the problem was that they should be responsible. Even on that basis, given that we started to learn about this in the 1970s and 1980s, And certainly by the time of the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, all of the nations, including the United States under Ronald Reagan, signed on to a statement that we should prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change. Certainly after that period of time, we've known what we were doing. Yet the affluent nations have continued to put the majority of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Only now has China quite recently overtaken the United States, despite having a population about 4 times larger. So even on that basis, it's the affluent nations that bear the historical responsibility and should take the largest share of doing something about it. Suppose though you say, well, that's history now, let's look at what's going on right now. It's unrealistic to expect the affluent nations to take so much of the responsibility for cleaning up. How would you do it on a per capita sort of basis? Because I think you would have to say, if you're talking about fair shares, just as with the slice of cake, you would say, well, we'll just divide it up equally, give everybody the same share. But if you were to do that, you would have to say, okay, so how big is the cake? How much of the atmosphere, how much can we still add to the atmosphere in terms of greenhouse gases without causing dangerous anthropogenic climate change? And how do we divide that up among the people of the world? Well, on one view, we've already really pretty much used all of the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb greenhouse gases, or at least very close to it, depending on whether we go for a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures over pre-industrial levels, which is what the Paris Agreement said we should stay well below, or if we go to the 1.5 degrees Celsius that many developing nations, including smaller island nations that are worried about being actually disappearing under the oceans if climate change causes sea level to rise, on that basis we are already very close. But in either way, on a per capita basis, we would have to say that it's again the affluent nations who are using far more than their equal per capita share. Because you look at what nations like Australia, where I'm recording this talk to you now, or the United States are putting into the atmosphere on a per capita basis. Australia is about 26 tons per capita of carbon dioxide per year. The United States is about 20. But if you were to say, how much could you, what would be the average per capita, it's 3.7 tons. So essentially, the United States is using 5 times its per capita share and would have to cut its emissions by 80% to 20% of what they are now. Australia to only 15% of what they are now. European nations certainly down to half of what they are now. Whereas many of the poorer nations wouldn't have to reduce them at all. India and Pakistan, for example, are using only about half of their per capita share of what could go into the atmosphere in order to stay below that 2 degrees Celsius level. So it's still going to be the rich nations that are going to have to make the most drastic cuts. And whichever way you look at it of these two principles, I think you have to say that what the rich nations are doing is ethically indefensible, because we are inflicting damage on the poorest nations and we are taking a huge risk. In fact, even if we stay at that 2 degrees Celsius level, which so far it doesn't look like we're going to be able to do, but even if we do, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that still means that there is a 33% probability of dangerous anthropogenic climate change. Basically what that means is of climate change getting out of control to the point at which various feedback loops cut in and reinforce the warming so that we don't know where it will end up. An example of a feedback loop is the warming of the permafrost in Siberia, which holds unknown quantities of trapped methane, a very potent greenhouse gas. So if we warm to 2 degrees Celsius, and there's at least a 1/3 chance that enough permafrost will thaw to release more methane, so that even if our own human emissions are cut to zero, we will still have dangerous anthropogenic climate change. And that could mean, as I said, all sorts of things. Dramatic changes in rainfall patterns. On one model, it could mean the failure of the Indian monsoon, which provides rain to feed more than 1 billion people on the Indian subcontinent. It could mean sea levels rising by various estimates, perhaps by as much as 3 meters by the end of the century, which would inundate most of the world's major cities, which are coastal cities, and of course inundate fertile delta regions that are intensively farmed by, for example, people in Bangladesh, on the Mekong Delta in Southeast Asia, or the Nile Delta in Egypt. So we are actually going to damage millions, perhaps billions of people, perhaps make the places where they live unlivable, create problems of refugees that absolutely dwarf the problems that we have today, although we think that they're serious enough. And we will be doing all this because we choose to live a certain lifestyle, because we choose to live a lifestyle that uses fossil fuels for transport, that includes flying to conferences, of course, but also uses them for heating, for stationary power generation. We are choosing to have a lifestyle that is high in animal products, which, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, produces more greenhouse gases than the entire transport sector. So more greenhouse gases from meat and dairy production than from all cars, planes, trains, ships, and so on. These are choices that we make, and we have to see that they are ethically indefensible choices to make. We have various ethical options then. We can try to change our own lifestyle and set examples not to emit more greenhouse gases than we need to. But probably that's really not going to be enough. Probably there's not going to be enough people, unfortunately, who are going to make drastic enough changes to make the difference. Because it's difficult to do when you see that everyone around you is just blithely going on with their high energy, high meat consumption lifestyle. So we really need to have government policies that put taxes or other restrictions on high levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And for that we need to be active, involved citizens. And part of that, as I've been saying, is to try to help our fellow citizens and politicians to understand that this is a great moral challenge, perhaps the great moral challenge of the 21st century, and will determine the kind of world that we leave, not just, as I say, to our children and grandchildren, but to other people who are going to be less able to cope, will have fewer resources to cope with the situation that we are creating, that we are imposing on them. If we could see this, if we could somehow magically see the harm that we're doing to them in 50 or 100 years' time, if we could see how they can't grow crops, how they have to leave their land, how they're hungry, then maybe we would have the right kind of visceral responses, the ones that, as I said at the beginning, we've evolved to have when we see people in need right in front of us. But as we can't do that, we have to rely on whatever means of persuasion we can, and I think getting people to understand the ethics of climate change is a vital part of that kind of persuasion. Thank you very much.